It began with a change in the air. Not thunder, not radio signals, not a flicker in the sky, or a warning for machines. Just density, the kind you feel in your teeth before a storm. Though the clouds were clear, birds began flying in wide, disorganized spirals. Dogs barked at walls. Wind turbines slowed, not because the wind had died, but because it had shifted into something that resisted turning. Then, the first one appeared over a soybean field outside Sault Ste. Marie. It didn't fall. It didn't land. It simply was. A hulking cap of chrome black, as wide as a village and motionless as glass. Its underside was lined with fibrous ridges that bristled faintly in the breeze. The structure resembled a portobello mushroom, but if you'd never seen one and were asked to dream it under sedation, it floated 4 meters off the ground, casting no shadow, emitting no sound. And then there were more. One over the mangroves in Belize, another hovering motionless above a Mongolian salt flat, a third submerged waist-deep in the Baltic Sea, dripping soundless ripples across the water. Hundreds more emerged in odd-numbered patterns across the globe, always in out-of-place places, never symmetrical, never coordinated. They floated like forgotten punctuation. The world did not scream. Not immediately. At first, people simply went quiet. That was what every observer would note in hindsight. Not the fear, not the awe, but the pause. A global inhalation without the comfort of exhale. In metro stations, commuters stood frozen on escalators, their phones half-raised. In remote villages, people dropped buckets beside wells and watched the sky like they'd forgotten what they came for. An artist in Copenhagen burst into tears while painting an egg. A child in Accra whispered, "They look hungry," without knowing why. Across 6 continents, the mushroom form stood in alien stillness. Not futuristic, not organic, just other. Governments reacted like bitten animals. Jets scrambled, though the ships moved with a slowness that mocked urgency. Satellite uplinks jammed not from interference, but from indecision. Warnings were issued in every language, but the tone was always the same. Half-barked orders muffled by uncertainty. And still the ships made no move. It became evident quickly. They weren't here to be understood. Not yet. In a makeshift briefing tent near the initial Sault Ste. Marie object, Canadian officials brought in everything from linguists to botanists. A team from the University of Toronto noted the faint scent of petrichor surrounding the object. Another noted the air temperature within a kilometer radius was 2 degrees warmer, but only at waist height. Oddest of all were the dreams. By dusk, a pattern emerged. People living within sight of the ships began reporting unexplainable dreams, colorless sequences, thick with sound and the sensation of damp breath on skin. None identical, none coherent, but all unmistakably shared. Some were moved, some were terrified, but most felt something far worse, anticipation. The press dubbed them spires at first, then cups, eventually the drown tops. But the internet rejected every official name. Someone posted a grainy image of one hovering over a crumbling train station in rural India. The caption read, "They're not ships. Ships go places." The image went viral. At 2:23 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, all 211 objects simultaneously rotated, clockwise, a single degree. Just once, then stilled again. That motion was enough to convince the world this was not a storm. This was not weather. And whatever it was already here. At 5:06 a.m., Universal Time coordinated. Every one of the mushroom forms shuddered. Not visibly, not enough to rattle the cameras or register on seismic graphs, but people felt it in their chest cavities, as though something enormous had drawn breath through them. Wind stalled. Leaves trembled without moving. In the silence that followed, the sky seemed to hang looser around the world. And then they opened. From the undersides of the massive caps, a fine particulate began to unfurl. Not ejected, not sprayed, just loosed. Billowing down in spiraling columns, the substance floated like golden dust at first, until it hit the air. Then it changed. The color warped to a soft lavender gray. Not luminous, not matte, something in between. It seemed to adjust to ambient light like it understood it, bending itself to the visual language of wherever it fell. To the naked eye, it shimmered without gleaming. It pooled without collecting. It resisted categorization. It was not ash, not fog, not pollen. And yet somehow it was all three. People breathed it in, not because they were careless, but because it was everywhere. The first reactions were unnoticed. The earliest symptoms were too subtle for panic. Heightened awareness of color, a strange pulsing sensation behind the eyes, a phantom taste of stoned fruit in the mouth. Some reported distant, sounds becoming clearer. Others claimed their skin felt less separate. But then came the dreaming, lucid and persistent, like one long, continuous sleepwalk shared by millions. Across countries, languages, age, and belief, people began speaking of the second world. Not a place, but a sensation, a parallel rhythm to the waking world, made of breath and whisper, where time folded like wet cloth. In this second world, things moved beneath the surface, shapes made of root and smoke. Some saw patterns, others saw voices. Most could not describe what they saw, only what they felt: belonging, fear, invitation, warning. Hospitals filled with the sleepless. Therapists couldn't keep up. People stopped using alarm clocks. And strangest of all, crime dropped. Not to zero, but significantly, inexplicably, as if something vital had shifted under the threshold of conscious thought. A word emerged online: mycelium, a made-up term to describe the shared sense of being watched from beneath. A soft dread, a blooming connection. And then the ships landed. No descent, no ceremony, just a slow, downward yield, like something sinking into acceptance. One by one, the great domes pressed downward until their caps gently touched the earth. No explosion, no noise, just pressure and permanence. Where each one met soil, stone, or sea, a perimeter of hair-thin roots began to extrude outward. Not roots, precisely, but radial tendrils, faintly glowing and semi-translucent. They moved with impossible grace, uncurling, seeking, connecting. Within hours, every ship on Earth had begun threading its way into the ground. By the end of the day, the networks were visible from orbit, faint fractal lines crawling outward like ancient veins beneath the crust, subtle enough to be missed unless you were looking. They avoided concrete. They avoided metal. But they adored forests, prairies, riverbanks. They spidered beneath homes and humming power lines without disrupting them. They seemed to know what to touch and what not to. In one case, a line stopped half an inch from the foundation of a kindergarten and grew no further for a full 24 hours. In another, a root line coiled once around the base of an abandoned oil rig in the Bering Sea and turned black. No one knew what it meant. The dreams deepened. Now people began speaking in sleep, whispering phrases in a language they swore they didn't know. Farmers described feeling their soil like skin. Musicians reported composing music that came from underground. A blind woman in Morocco painted detailed diagrams of what she called the map beneath movement. A prisoner in Nevada wrote a 200-page journal in his own blood, only to collapse smiling and silent. What unified them all wasn't content. It was calm, as if everyone who breathed the spore dust felt something that had never existed before. Purpose without clarity. The world, for a moment, stopped pretending it understood itself. And the ships, if they were ships, no longer felt like visitors. They felt like seeds. The churches filled first. From the mountain chapels of Guatemala to the chrome megastructures of Texas suburbia, every kind of house of worship saw its congregation swell in the days after the ships planted themselves. Not all came to pray. Some came to scream. Others came in silence, drawn by an ache too complex for language. The faithful, the broken, the merely curious, they stood shoulder to shoulder beneath stained glass and neon halos, asking the same question in different dialects of fear. What does God do when the sky plants itself in the dirt? In Lahore, an imam closed his Quran mid-sermon and stepped outside without a word, standing beneath the slow crawl of mycelial light bleeding through the earth like veins of moon milk. He remained there until dawn. In Berlin, a televangelist declared the ships to be fungal angels and urged his viewers to ingest powdered mushrooms to open the doorways of divine telepathy. Within a week, he was found in a cathedral's crypt, smiling, hands coated in clay. But not all turned toward worship. Some broke from it. A new sect emerged, unaffiliated with any known creed, calling themselves the Hallowed. They shaved their heads and wore masks of soft cloth, stained with soil. They held no rituals, made no proclamations, except one, spoken softly to any who asked. They are not here for us. We are the mulch. Meanwhile, the roots beneath the ships were not idle. Across every continent, they continued to spread, slowly, deliberately, with a patience that felt alien. They never pierced homes or graves or anything that vibrated with recent grief. They were sensitive, if not sentient. That was what Dr. Kale Nwosu proposed in his unauthorized field recordings. A soil microbiologist turned rogue philosopher. He'd camped near the northern Botswana filament line, tracing its growth patterns with strips of iron filings and sensitive vibratory plates. His findings were recorded just days before he vanished. They're not expanding. They're listening. The roots aren't roots, they're sensors. Nervous tissue. This is not conquest. This is communion. The roots pulsed faintly at night, barely perceptible, unless one stood directly above them. Like a second heartbeat, not your own. Farmers in Arkansas said their crops ripened a week early. A shepherd in Lebanon found his goats sleeping in strange spiral formations near the tendrils. A geologist in central Turkey discovered that seismic noise in the region had dropped to near zero, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. And then came the humming. It started in isolated places, rural, quiet, far from electromagnetic interference. A low, resonant tone, somewhere between the call of a whale and the vibration of glass under pressure. It emanated from the roots, not loud, not constant, but rhythmic, cyclical. People near the hum zones reported strange behaviors in animals. Ant colonies began constructing their tunnels in mirrored spiral patterns. Horses refused to move eastward. Beekeepers opened their hives to find hexagonal combs grown in fractal arrangements, perfect and impossible. The roots were not invading. They were synchronizing. Back in the sanctuaries and temples, religious leaders wrestled with a new fear. Not that this was the end of days, but that it might be something older, something that preceded days. Scriptures were reread with fungal metaphors in mind. Mycelium was the word now whispered in place of Messiah. Psalms were reinterpreted to speak of God's footstool as something buried, something biological. Pope Clement XVII addressed the world with a shaking voice. If they were meant to destroy us, they would have done so already. But perhaps they came to remind us. We are not the first voices in the dirt. Beneath the Amazon basin, one of the root tendrils passed through an unmapped cave system and then stopped. It lingered for days. And then, unprovoked, a circle of bioluminescent mushrooms erupted on the forest floor in perfect silence. The next day, every camera in the region failed. But for those who were there, the message was clear, though they could not articulate it. The ships were not waiting. They were growing something, and the planet, long dormant, long loud, long ignored, was beginning to respond. Dr. Kale Nwosu was not the first to study the root lines, but he was the first to speak to them. Before his disappearance, he had abandoned his lab, stripped his name from academic registries, and wandered into the Okavango floodplains with 2 items: a soil sensor kit retrofitted to detect non-chemical resonance, and a broken metronome from his childhood. They pulse like memory, he once wrote. I think rhythm matters. Kale had always been a difficult man to categorize. A Nigerian Guyanese microbiologist trained in Western science, raised in Igbo spiritualism, and privately obsessed with deep biosphere communication. He'd published dozens of papers no one could fully agree with. His work was often dismissed as philosophy with a microscope. But when the ships came and the roots began to grow, Kale's phone never stopped ringing. He answered none of the calls. Instead, he walked into the floodplain and followed a single root line, one that curved in a perfect Fibonacci arc across the landscape. He recorded everything: soil pH changes, electromagnetic echoes, fungal pheromone releases, even his dreams. The last file on his recorder was whispered at 3:14 a.m. They are growing intelligence. Not a mind, but a network memory. It's not for us. It's not even about us, but wants to understand what we did wrong. His tent was found days later, untouched. A thin film of lavender dust coated the equipment. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away. Only one thing disturbed the silence. A perfect circle of mossy, semiluminescent growth had formed around the tent, the diameter exactly 9 meters. The center of the circle was empty. No root line passed through it. Only a single mycelial node had emerged in the middle, smooth, glassy, and faintly pulsing. It resembled no fungus known to science. Biologists would later call it K-root, in honor or caution of kale. But what grew from it was not merely fungal. It began as signal. First observed by satellite thermal scans over central Botswana, the area around the K-root began to emit structured warmth. Not random heat, but patterned. A series of concentric temperature fluctuations that mirrored human neural oscillations. EEG researchers were the first to notice. It's a dream wave. A planetary scale reverie. Like someone trying to remember everything at once. As the wave spread, other K-roots began to emerge at distant sites, each where a person had disappeared near a root line. They appeared not just in wilderness, but in unlikely urban seams, a collapsed underpass in Sao Paulo, the husk of a fire-gutted library in Aleppo, a sealed-off subway tunnel beneath Kyoto. Always quiet, always marked by the absence of the person who first found them. Each node connected. Each node pulsed. The pattern was unmistakable. They were growing a memory system across the planet, composed not of neurons, but of us. Or rather, of those of us who listened. Kale Nwosu did not return. But his voice did. Weeks after his disappearance, his whisper began echoing in the dreams of others who had touched the K-root or walked the mycelial lines barefoot. First in fragments. Then, with terrifying clarity. It isn't terraforming. That's what we thought. But they aren't shaping the planet. They're restoring it. Through those dreams, a picture formed, not of conquest or salvation, but of recursion. A cycle that predates human memory. A networked intelligence that blooms only when a planet begins to forget itself. Something that arises in the rot. The ship's seeds. The roots' sensors. The K-roots' conscious memory cores. Built from organic minds willing to dissolve into the soil. What was growing was not a forest. It was a recollection. The hallowed took this as gospel. They're harvesting our regrets, one said, turning grief into roots. Others resisted the idea, calling it heresy, but none could explain why the dreams persisted, or why the K-root moss now mirrored human fingerprints in its growth patterns. As more disappeared, voluntarily, into the root lines, it became clear. Kale Nwosu had not vanished. He had joined. The dream changed. For weeks, the dreams brought warmth, whispers, the pulse of root logic weaving through the dirt of minds. But then, one night, on no particular date, and under no particular moon, the dream became a vision. It came first to a woman named Lillian Park, a soil ecologist in northern British Columbia, who'd spent the past 2 months sleeping on a mycelial line that grew straight through her cabin. She described it as the planet remembering itself through me. She awoke gasping, hands gripping the wooden floor, eyes unfocused. Then she began drawing. Hundreds of pages. Not mushrooms, not symbols, but trajectories. Curved lines, arcing from deep space toward Earth. When decoded by an astrodynamicist from Kyoto University, they matched the paths of several recorded micrometeorite impacts, dating back hundreds of thousands of years, impacts no one had ever investigated. Until now, each asteroid, as it turned out, contained rare carbon-rich fragments laced with fossilized fungal structures. Mycofossils, impossible by Earth standards, too symmetrical, too intentional, each with unique molecular signatures. None native, none dead. In the vision, Humans saw what no species had seen before. The memory of a planet seeded from beyond. The scene unfolded across minds in dreamlike clarity. Asteroids, small and silent, scattered through the void. Not random, but chosen. Carriers of spores engineered to survive heat, vacuum, radiation. Not machines. Not life forms. Something in between. Terraforming vectors of cognitive induction. The spores weren't sent to colonize the Earth. They were sent to accelerate it. Embedded in these ancient fungal payloads was a language not of words, but of growth instruction. The spores integrated with primitive microbial ecologies, creating networks beneath the surface, silent, patient. And when primates first emerged, those networks began interacting with their neurology, not through infection, through invitation. The memory unraveled slowly, beautifully, terribly. At certain elevations, in certain seasons, early hominids encountered rare mushroom growths, odd in shape, faintly luminescent, deeply psychoactive. The visions they provoked rewired cognition. Abstract thought formed. Language appeared like frost overnight. Fire was no longer feared but understood. Pattern recognition emerged where instinct once ruled. The spores didn't teach humans how to survive. They taught them how to remember what they had never known. This was not divine intervention. It was guided recursion. And the species that sent them, unnamed, unseen, had done this before. Across galaxies, across epochs, always the same pattern. Seed the planet. Trigger cognitive acceleration. Wait until the memory grows dense enough to reach back. The ships didn't come to conquer. They came because humanity had finally remembered enough of the implanted memory map to be found again. The root lines, now spreading faster beneath the crust, began illuminating subterranean pathways, corridors of glowing fungal lattice buried for eons. Dormant, waiting. No one had built them. They had grown themselves, each cell like a page from a forgotten book. At the K-roots, the pulses synchronized. Satellite thermal readings confirmed it. Every root line across the globe began beating in unison, a planetary heartbeat. In the dream, Lillian and others saw the final layer of truth. The ships weren't visitors. They were harvesters, but not of biomass, of memory. The collective memory of a species reaching the point of self-recognition, ready to be woven into a cosmic mycelial intelligence older than time as humans measured it. Humanity was not the crop. It was the fruiting body. And now the aliens, if that word even applied, were not arriving for first contact. They were arriving to gather what had grown, to fold the accumulated emotional, psychological, and evolutionary memory of the human species into their own, just as they had done on other worlds before. This was not invasion. This was ascension, and it had always been scheduled. The final gathering began at midnight, though no clocks would mark the hour. Across the world, the root lines pulsed brighter, first lavender, then deep indigo, then a radiant white so pure it seemed to bend the air itself. The K-roots erupted into full bloom, not into mushrooms or flowers, but into sprawling geometric structures of organic crystal, each one humming a single note, a note without pitch, a note that was a place and a time and a memory folded inside itself. Every human alive felt the pull, not in their bones or blood, but in their story, the silent inner thread of selfhood that they mistook for their own creation. The pull wasn't violent. It wasn't theft. It was an opening, a widening of invisible doors. The ships remained rooted to the ground for one breath longer. Then they began to gather. It happened without spectacle. No beams of light. No gravitational distortions. No rapture. The root line shivered, and in doing so, they drank. They absorbed the memories stored in the soil, the breath of old cities, the dreams that had bled into battlefields, the laughter stitched into nursery walls, the tears that seeped between church stones. Every story, every wordless longing, every unmarked triumph, the invisible sediment of human existence, was drawn up through the tendrils into the bodies of the ships. The ships filled themselves not with atoms, but with meaning. And humanity felt lighter, somehow. Not empty, not erased, only released. The collective grief, the inherited fears, The burden of wars long past and cruelties unnamed, it all lifted like mist from a river in the dawn. The sky shivered once, and then the ships, those colossal caps that had loomed like questions above the earth, detached themselves with the slow, deliberate grace of something both triumphant and sorrowful. They rose in silence, slipping back into the blackness between stars, without ever once speaking to the creatures they had midwifed into thinking beings. Not a single word, only the whisper of parting roots and the slow return of ordinary gravity. But they did not leave the world unchanged. In the wake of the ship's departure, K-roots, those crystalline fungal blooms, crumbled into fine silver dust. The dust sank into the ground, and where it touched, life shifted. Subtly at first, quietly. In forests, trees began communicating more vividly through root networks, accelerating nutrient sharing across entire ecosystems. In coastal waters, coral reefs began healing themselves from bleaching at rates once thought impossible. Crops in depleted fields awoke, thriving not from chemicals, but from connection to unseen networks beneath the soil. And in humans, the change was deeper still. Not physical, not immediate, but the children born after the gathering began displaying subtle differences. Higher empathy thresholds, increased pattern recognition, an intuitive awareness of interdependence between living things, a comfort with ambiguity, a resilience against existential fear. Language acquisition changed, creativity flourished in new, unpredictable directions. Where once humans built walls and engines, they now began weaving unseen threads between ideas, people dreams. It was not mind control. It was evolution, the next step that had always been hidden in the seed of what it meant to be human. The gift was simple, a restored capacity to grow wisely, without instruction, without domination, without needing gods or saviors from the sky. The aliens had not come to rule, to teach, or to punish. They had come to harvest memory, and in doing so, had freed the species to become something even they, the ancient gardeners, could no longer predict. For the first time, humanity was no longer a project. It was a partner. The earth exhaled, unburdened and newborn beneath the stars. And somewhere in the immeasurable dark, the gatherers drifted on toward the next silent, sleeping world, seeds already in hand, ready to dream another planet awake. 1,000 generations later, Earth no longer resembled the old blue marble that spun beneath mushroom-shaped shadows. The oceans had retreated and returned in cycles. The forests had grown into spires. Animals had changed, reshaped by the unseen architectures of the soil. Cities were no longer cities, but living symphonies, structures grown from biomatter, singing in harmony with the seasons, bending to the needs of their inhabitants. And the inhabitants, they were still called humans, though no ancient mirror would have recognized them. Their bodies had refined, softened, elongated. Not taller, not stronger, deeper. Skin had adapted to whisper with the air around it. Tiny bioluminescent flecks shifting color to mirror mood and meaning. Language had become partly telepathic, carried in waves of feeling and shared metaphor instead of clumsy words. Each mind was individual, yet always lightly threaded to others, like islands linked by underwater bridges of thought. Violence became as rare as a solar eclipse possible, but so alien to instinct that it evoked confusion rather than rage. They no longer farmed the land, they conversed with it. They no longer built governments of law and sword. They wove councils of memory and anticipation. They no longer feared death. They saw it as a continuation of root into root, self into soil, memory into world. Technology was alive, not mechanical, but fungal, crystalline, woven from the same substances that had once shivered under their feet as spores. Vessels of shimmering growth carried them not just across their own skies, but eventually into the rivers of space itself. When the time came, when they grew beyond their world without abandoning it, they built no rockets. Instead, they grew vessels from their own histories, seeded them with their dreams, and launched themselves into the stars the same way the ones before had once sent spores to Earth, quietly, gently, without conquest, without demand. Not to dominate, not to escape, but to continue the ancient, unbroken rhythm. Grow, remember, seed, begin again. The once humans were no longer merely children of Earth. They had become the gardeners of worlds, yet unawakened, and far beyond any telescope's reach. In the fertile dark between stars, they sowed the first dreams into sleeping soil. The cycle whispered onward. The universe listened. And this time, it was humanity who taught it to sing.